If you want your spaceship renders to look like this, boy, do I have a tool for you. Today we're going to be looking at the tool that I have always wanted to have at my disposal, and it is going to make this process so much easier. But first, we have to have a spaceship. We're going to be using this beautiful Gozanti cruiser modeled by Kim Merzen, which you can go and buy right now on the Digital Shipyard Art Station. There will be a link to that down in the description. And you are also going to need the brand new space opera textures from FraserEffects.com, and there will be a link to that down in the description as well. And our brand new Blender scene here, we've gone ahead and imported our model. We're going to just pop in a rendered view so that we can kind of see what's going on. Give it a moment to load because this is a beautiful model. Oh my goodness, just look at it. It's so gorgeous. This is honestly one of my favorites, and it's featured a lot on my Instagram, and for good reason. And we'll actually take our background, and I'm going to disconnect it. You won't have a sky texture automatically set up. That's just how I set up my scene. But we want to go ahead and make sure that it's blank. I've got a collection called lights, and I'm going to go ahead and add a sunlight. We'll give it a strength of about 175. And you want to make sure that in our color management, the exposure is set to -4.5. That's going to emulate pretty realistically the strength of the sun in atmosphere, which is technically a little unrealistic for space, but it looks a little bit better, with a camera set to like, normal shutter speed in f/22. We can turn off our overlays just to see a little bit better. And this spaceship, I mean, it looks really cool, but we're missing the textures, which is obviously what you came here for. So let's go ahead and split the view, and we're going to change this to the shader editor. We can hit N to collapse this side panel. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to use maybe making sure we're on the Gozanti hull material. In this case, whatever your hull material is, we're going to add a panel's small material. Now, if your textures aren't like mapping nicely in this square fashion on the ship, what we can actually do is change this to object and swap this from flat to box. Now, we can probably actually change the scale to like 0.5. Maybe even smaller than that, 0.25. And you can see we've got these panels kind of nicely tiled across the surface. We'll even go a little bit lower. 0.15 looks all right. Man, honestly, we could go like, nah, too much. 0.15. And, bam, you got a spaceship. It's got spaceship panels on it. And this is a place where we could leave it. But this isn't usually the way that I prepare my textures. So let's talk about this pack a little bit for a second here. I've included a bunch of cool texture sets, like the panels texture we just used. There's also a larger variation of that and a couple of other panels. There's some different screen textures. There's a solar wings texture, which is cool, some cargo boxes, hangar floors, and all sorts of other neat stuff. And you can apply those directly to your models. They're full PBR texture maps, which means that they will work in all sorts of different render engines, and they will look fantastic. But the way that I like to work in Blender is a little bit different. Now, you can go ahead and just download the pack if you want to and just use those textures straight, but I'm going to show you my workflow. So what we've got here is pretty decent, but I'm actually going to scrap all of it. What I like to do is I like to start to build from the ground up with a brand new grunge pass. Now, I've created this special blue concrete texture, which is inspired by textures that I would like to use all of the time in my own work. You see, the reason why I created this pack is not to create a new set of textures, but to create the exact kind of thing that I've always wanted to have at my disposal. All of these nice high-resolution textures with all of the attributes that I find to be amazing when making spaceships. So we're going to set up this texture to be basically the same thing as the other texture map. And you can see we've got this sort of generic-looking grunge. And I mean, this looks all right. This is something, but it doesn't really look like a spaceship yet. We can plug this into our base color just so that we have like something like a line here to work off of, and then we can add things in between here. The first thing I'm going to do is add a mix RGB shader. Now, if you've used After Effects, we can use this like the tint effect. If we just plug our texture into the factor, color 1 becomes our black value, and color 2 becomes our white value. So we can take our ship here, and we can give this sort of the base color range, maybe make it just a tiny bit blue, just a little bit. Then we can take this, make it a little bit darker, make it a little bit more saturated, and you can see we're just adding a bit of variation to the surface. Maybe we bring this hue a little bit more too. So you've basically just got these two slightly bluish gray colors. And it helps to add a little bit of variation to the surface so we can see some texture, but it's not a lot. It's not overwhelming texture. Now, while this pack includes a couple of other textures that we can use here for this texture set, we're actually not going to use those. Because again, the way that I work is a little bit different. I've set it up so that you can work in a number of different ways, and this is my favorite way to use them. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead to our imperfections folder. And what I want to find is I want to use one of these. Let's take one of the smudge textures. I'm going to take smudges base color 3. And you can see we've got a nice combination of some of these scratches and also some nice little bits of grunge. So some smudges and some of the scratches and everything. What we're going to do is we're going to add another mix RGB shader and plug this into color 2. And we can change this to screen. And what this is going to do is it's basically going to add that smudges texture on top. Now I like to do it, I like to mix it in white. You can do it in a different way if you wanted to invert the texture maybe and set it to multiply. You could have these dark scratches. The way that I usually do it though, I like to set it to screen and have light scratches. And they don't need to be too bright. If we look at the final material here, we can see how that looks. Yeah, and you can see like maybe 0.25 is a pretty good value. So far we've got a pretty simple shader, but it's not looking too bad. We've got a nice bit of detail with some of the smudges and the grunge and some of these nice scratches along the surface. We've got, I think, a pretty decent amount of variation. I'm noticing maybe the base color is a little bit bright, so we'll just bring this down a bit to like 0.2, and maybe this can be brought down to like 0.4-ish. Yeah, that feels a little bit meaner. Now, the next element that I want to add is I want to put some dirt in some of the crevices in between these panels and in these big corners here. The way that we do that is using ambient occlusion. So I'll hit Shift-A and I'll just search, and ambient occlusion is actually right at the top. So if we preview this, we can see that it's adding in darkness where all of these crevices are. If we click only local, what this is going to do is it's going to make sure that objects only cast ambient occlusion onto themselves. Let me show you what happens if we don't have that. If we were to add in a cube, for example, we would start to see that darkening happening where it intersects with the cube, which isn't what we want. Because if that's the case, any other spaceship that gets near to this, or if it gets near to the ground, suddenly all of this dirt is going to appear out of nowhere. But if we click only local, you can see that that disappears. We still have the crevices on this model, but they don't intersect with this cube, which is excellent. Now, by default, I think it's a little bit too smooth, so we're going to bring in another texture. Let's actually bring in the blue concrete black and white map, which is just a bit of a different variation of the default blue concrete. We'll bring all of these up to kind of separate it and just duplicate this node setup. So we're looking at something like this. These are not connected yet. We'll just set this to box and we can get an idea of how this looks. That's pretty cool. We'll just make the scale a little bit different. And now what we can do is if we actually plug this color into the distance of the ambient occlusion, look at how suddenly it's a lot grungier. Now we've got all this variation in texture. It really looks like it's been beat up and, you know, been to maybe a bunch of different planets that are very dirty. If we add in a map range node, we can control the minimum and maximum amount of that distance. So maybe set this to like 0.1 and 0.8, kind of dial it back a little bit, but make sure that it's never really all the way in. And then if we add in a color ramp, we can maybe pull in this black handle just to get a bit more dirt out of it. Yeah. So you can see we're sort of building that crevice map. So this is how that node setup is looking. And to integrate it with our main setup, what I'll do is I'll add, in this case, maybe a multiply node. What we actually need to do is invert this map that we just made. So now the crevices are white. Plug that into the factor of the multiply node, set it to multiply, and now we can mess around with our dirt color. Yeah, something like that. I mean, you know, you can pick whatever color you think looks like a good dirt. If you just want it to make it a little bit darker, if you know, whatever you want to do. This looks kind of gnarly though. It's pretty mean. Now if we look at the final result, you can definitely get a sense that it's a bit dirtier. If we look at it before and after, there's definitely a bit more going on there. I think we can make it a bit more intense though if we want to make it more noticeable. So now it definitely looks like it's been to a lot of different worlds. This really sort of feeds into that Star Wars dystopian style. Everything is just kind of dirty and beat up, and it really feels used and lived in. And I really admire that. It actually reminds me of the work of a very talented modeler in the Star Wars community called Fractal Sponge. And he makes these incredible Star Destroyer 3D models. And this is starting to come together like some of the materials from his work. And I think that's really cool. But I think we can go a step further from this. This is pretty cool, but I think we can pull all of this out to the side. I want to add in some like streaks, some like liquid drips. So what we're going to try is we're going to go back to our imperfections, and I actually have a couple of liquid drips colors. Let's try liquid drips 2. We can get our mapping texture node set up, and set this to box, bring down the scale a lot, and we'll notice that it's sideways right now, which is not what we want. So if we play around with the rotation, maybe it's the Y rotation. Yeah, set the Y to 90. Now we're getting some weirdness here where that's getting all stretched out. Maybe, what if we change this to generated instead? Here we're getting into some of the problem solving. Let's set this to flat, question mark. Now this actually, now that I look at it, is fine. So we've got these big white streaks on the top. That's actually okay. And here's why. So what we're gonna do, we have this normal output from the texture coordinate node. If we add a separate XYZ node, we can take, in this case, I think it's the X. Yeah, we can take the X value. I think we've also got these streaks on the bottom. Yeah, which we don't want. We don't want them on the top or the bottom. So if we take, in this case, the X, because I guess it's probably rotated a bit weird. If we clear our rotate, yeah, here our rotation is a little bit weird. We can just, honestly, we can just apply the rotation. So applying our rotation actually fixes our issue. Now we don't actually have to change anything, but I'm still going to do it. So now we actually have to plug this into the Z. And what I'm going to go ahead and do here is, this is actually not too bad if we maybe bring this up, because what we want is the surfaces that are black on the Z channel. We want these bottom surfaces to just have less of the streaks. So let's add a mix RGB node. Plug our drip space color into the top input and the color amp into the bottom. And if we set this to multiply, we can actually take out those streaks on the bottom, which maybe you don't want all of them out, but we can go maybe most of the way. And then if you were to do like maybe a color amp and just bring up the contrast a bit, you can see now we've got more streaks up here than we have down there, which I think is kind of a cool look. This is before we do that and then after. So we just have less streaks now, which honestly isn't a bad thing. Now, if we add another multiply node to our main line, we can take our color amp and plug it into the bottom input. And this one's already set to multiply, which is good. So what we're going to start to get is everything but those streaks is going to be darkened, which is the opposite of what we want. So if we take an invert node and invert this color amp, I mean, we could flip the color amp as well, but I've decided to just invert it. Now those streaks are going to be dark. It's going to be like it's dripped maybe some oil. The other way that we could do this is we could actually change the colors of our color amp here. Maybe this is easier. We'll change the colors of our color amp. And then this way we can select sort of a new color for the streaks. So maybe we get something a bit rustier. We get like these rusty drips. Maybe we like that a little bit more. Feels like it's been dripping down the side of the ship and maybe cause some of the metal to rust. That could be interesting. That could be an interesting story to tell. So we could even turn that all the way up. And I think maybe we'll leave that there. It just adds another level of detail and complexity. So you can see so far, we've gone ahead, we've taken our concrete texture, we've layered on some light scratches, we've layered on some dirt in the crevices, and then in some of these detail places here, we've added in just a couple of little liquid streaks to our model. And this is how we build this effect. Now, of course, we're still missing a couple of channels. We don't have any normal detail, and we don't have any roughness detail. Now, what I've learned in my time is the normal detail doesn't matter all that much, except for one important node. We want to add in a bevel node, because no surfaces in real life, no objects have perfectly sharp corners like this. We have these perfectly mathematically sharp corners, and those don't exist in the real world. So if we just plug in this bevel node, you can see it kind of darkens around the edges. That's because right now it's a little bit, and over here it's brightening. That's because this is a little bit too wide of a radius. So if we set this to like 0.01, or even smaller than that, 0.005, you can see it looks like the surface has a small geometric bevel. Because what it's doing is it's taking the normals and it's smoothing it around that corner. And this just creates a little surface to catch the light, so we can see on these lines, sort of catching the light. And as we get up close, it helps to add a little bit more detail and complexity. Now we're going to use this node a little bit later, but for now, we can just leave that there. Now we need to handle the roughness. Now this is really important. So what I like to do is if we actually start, we could start from let's just start from this. Let's just plug this directly into the roughness. And we can see how now it looks really shiny. It's shiny, it's got a bit of grunge and interest. It's nice. What we're gonna do though is add maybe a color amp just to make it black and white. And then we will flip the color amp. Now when we do that, it's obviously gonna make it a whole lot rougher on average, but it's also gonna make this darker dirt. It's gonna make it more rough than the rest of the ship. It's also going to take these little smudges and these little scratches, and it's going to make them a little bit shinier. So let's go ahead and let's add in a gamma node. And we can turn this up a bit. And you can see that's just going to sort of bring down, it's going to almost add some contrast to our roughness. So we can look at the whole, we can look at the ship as a whole, bring it up a bit. I really liked it at 3 to 4, maybe 3. I kind of like that. That's not too bad. We can come in here. We can, if you want to add a bit more to the contrast, we could actually do this in the color ramp as well. There we go. So we just have a bit more visible detail. I mean, this is really up to you, kind of how you do this, how you decide to add your roughness, but I don't think this looks too shabby. Now you'll notice the interesting thing about the spaceship material, we haven't even added any panels. There have been no panel textures, and that's okay. We don't need any, because there are already modeled panels on the surface of the ship. But we can still add a little bit more detail if we use certain panel images. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the panel's small material, and I'm going to take maybe the base color 1 variation. So these materials, they come with 2 base colors, a regular color one, and one that's black and white. What we can do with this, if we set up, again, our little mapping node texture here, set it to box, to like 0.1, you know, to whatever we want it to be. We've got these nice panel textures here. And what we can do with this, we just kind of make ourselves a bit more room. We'll add in a mix RGB shader for the roughness and plug this in. And we'll actually maybe set this to overlay. So we can take where the panels are and we can make certain spots of the ship a little bit rougher and make some parts a little bit, some little squares a little bit shinier. And you can see that reflected in our material here. You can see how the roughness changes to honor that. So again, this is something you can change to your liking. I like to add in a bit so it's noticeable, but not like way too much. You could also play around with different blending modes. If you just wanted to do screen, or if you just wanted to do multiply just to make it shinier, or you wanted to just mix them. But I find overlay is kind of a good, in my opinion, it can be a nice little like midway. We could even make this smaller, 0.3 maybe. So it adds like this invisible level of detail that you don't notice until you look at the reflections. And suddenly there are all these smaller little squares and panels, which I think is interesting. The other cool thing about this is that this actually reflects a real technique that ILM used to use. It would add just a little bit of detail to the reflections so that when you get light pinging off of it, it looks like there are more panels than there actually are. So that's one thing that I like to apply every once in a while. This is pretty cool, but you know what? There's still one last really cool trick I want to show you, and it involves the bevel node that we just used. Let's duplicate this. Let's move this up here. I want to show you something kind of neat. So we've got all of this crevice dirt, but I want to show you a cool trick that does basically the opposite. So if we just take a look at our bevel here, we've just got a view of our normals, and we can increase the radius, and you can see how it blurs out the normals on those edges. Now this is actually useful for another secret trick. If we duplicate this bevel again and set the radius to 0, we've got these 2 images where the only difference is on the edges. So let's try adding in a mix RGB node. And if we mix them together and change it to maybe difference and turn the value all the way up, we've got all these neon looking colors, but only around the edges. We can make this whatever size we want, and we can even do the same thing we did for the ambient occlusion, duplicate our blue concrete texture, and plug that into the radius of our top bevel. These radius settings might be a little bit extreme. We'll maybe set this to like 0 and 0.1. You can see even bringing it up a bit, 0.2. This looks pretty gnarly. This looks pretty interesting. We got this nice smudgy looking texture. You can play around with some different blending modes as well, like you could do subtract instead, or divide maybe. Ooh, that's quite something. Dang, that is really intense. Difference is what I usually go with though. And then we can add a color ramp, so we can mess around with some of the contrast, but also so it makes it black and white. Now, hear me out. We'll put another mix RGB node for our base color. And if we plug this in, you can set it to whatever blending mode you want. But in this case, maybe we'll go with screen. You'll see that these edges get a little bit brighter, which like you don't necessarily want it to be too intense, but like it adds another element of weathering. And what the cool thing is, like it gets to this point where you're looking at just the color map here, but you can see all of the detail of the model. So here's before that and then after. So like I think it adds another really cool level of detail to our spaceship, and we can preview that with our principal BSDF here. See, I think that looks gnarly. I think that looks awesome. Maybe rotate our sun lamp here to get some more dramatic lighting. I mean, check it out. We got this super dramatic looking spaceship material. I think it looks awesome. I mean, look at this. We've got all of this really cool detail here. It feels very real and physical. And we've built out this entire thing right inside of Blender. We haven't used any crazy tools like Substance or Mari. We haven't used any external painting tools. This is entirely using a free 3D program and these resources. This looks awesome, but we're not done yet. We're still one step away from making a truly realistic spaceship using some of the other kinds of textures included in the pack. So if you want to find out how to do that, click on this video right here where I'm going to show you a fantastic technique using some of the emissive textures from the pack.